Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to have an important series that goes over the foundational elements that you need to control to get results and to get impact from every podcast interview. You see, without controlling for the crowd, the conversions, and the conversations, you're just talking. You're not making impact. So let's jump into how you can control the crowd.
Hi, Tom. Excited to get to talk with you today about controlling the crowd, what a lot of people would like to do with podcast interview marketing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's one of those things where it's foundational. There's no sense in podcast guesting or being on a podcast guest if you can't control the crowd that you're talking to, right? Often I'll hear people say, well, podcast guesting doesn't work. Well, that's like saying public speaking doesn't work or social media marketing doesn't work. And I'll say, if you go outside today and talk to a tree, you're not going to grow your business, right? That's not public speaking. If you put a cat meme up, don't expect your business to go crazy overnight. There's different things that you need to control. You need to control the crowd, the conversions, the conversations. And I'm really looking forward to digging into that first one. How can you control the crowd that you're talking to?
Absolutely. So, podcast guesting, as you pretty much mentioned, you might be speaking in public when you're speaking to a tree, but you're not public speaking. So, podcast guesting is not just a form of marketing. Can you explain why it's not just a form of marketing, and why are controlling the variables so incredibly important for impact?
Right. And so guesting is an activity, almost like public speaking is an activity, right? Um, go talking to a tree there, but that activity is not a strategy. So you need to control all of the variables that control that process to do that. And so you can't say enough of the right things to the wrong people or the wrong things to the right people. So this idea that I just need to get out on more podcasts, talk to more people. No, that's not the way it works. If that was the case, go to New York City and Times Square and just talk to everybody that walks by, right? If it's a numbers game, sooner or later, your perfect client is going to walk by. But we know that's not the way it works, right? Fishing is not a numbers game. It's not if you put your lure in water enough times, you'll catch a whale. It's like, no, it doesn't matter how many times you put it in the Great Lakes, you're not going to catch a shark. I don't care how many swimming pools you go to, you're not going to catch a whale. So from that standpoint, you have to control the crowd. You have to say, are the people that listening to this podcast, are they like my ideal customers, right? Because if they're not, it could be a very nice conversation, but don't expect to get business from it.
That makes absolute sense. I think it goes back to our philosophy of bigger is not better. Better is better. And so just kind of figuring out those variables and going from there. So, Tom, what are the three key things to control in order to maximize impact?
Yeah, and I mentioned these a little bit earlier, right? And we've always looked at these as they build upon each other, right? The first one, you've got to control who you're speaking to. We call that controlling the crowd, right? You better know, based on data, based on experience, if this is the right audience or not. And most people would think, well, that makes sense, right? But a lot of people don't do that. They'll just say any podcast. And would you jump on a plane to just go to talk to any audience on a stage? No, that'd be ridiculous. You'd want to know, who are they? Why are they there? Are they qualified buyers? Are they just nice people? Or are they qualified buyers? So the bare minimum is really to control that crowd of who you're talking to. The next one is, you may be talking to the nice and the right people, but are you doing things to move them from being a passive listener to an active visitor to an engaged lead? That's really controlling the conversions, moving them along. So it's, and the fishing analogy again, do you have the right bait? Do you have the right hook, right? On that. So if you control the crowd and you control the conversions, you've done everything you can to maximize the results from every person that listens to your podcast. but not everybody listens to the podcast. In fact, most of the people in the world will not be listening to that podcast interview, but you can still impact people by controlling the conversation. And that's where we tell people, don't do more interviews, do more with your interviews. And that's repurposing that content, getting a month's worth of content from every interview. And you see the best people doing this, right? Go on to social media right now. Gary Vaynerchuk, Tony Robbins, Alex Hormozy, they're not creating more content than you or I. They're just capturing it and then putting it out there. And I'm always amazed, Tony Robbins can do an event and he'll take those little clips from it and he'll put those up on his social media. And he's got all of this content. And the best podcast guests are doing that same thing. They're repurposing that content. And because it's so rich, it's so valuable, that's how you control the conversations afterwards.
Absolutely. And I know the next 2 weeks, we're going to go into more of controlling the conversations and controlling the conversions and such. But obviously, right now, we're going to talk about controlling the crowd because that is the most important focus for the first initial part of podcast guesting. So how can someone ensure that they are speaking to the right audience on a podcast? Because since it is so important to control that crowd first.
Um, there's the qualitative and the quantitative, right? So if you have no data, if you're not licensing the databases, what you can do is look at the host. Often the audience is like the host or aspires to be like the host, right? So if you want to talk to Gen Zers, don't go on a podcast hosted by someone that's got as much gray hair as I do, right? Because the host will not be interested in the topic, and vice versa, right? If you're targeting a female audience, you're probably got a better chance if the host is female, or vice versa. Age, interests, right? If you've got somebody talking about solopreneurship or entrepreneurship, right? Great topic, but don't expect that Fortune 500 CEOs are going to be there. So that's the first one, more the qualitative. Would the host be a good guest or a good listener, a good client for me? Now, if you license data, you can find out other things too. So there are databases out there and we use a bunch of them. You can say, of everyone that goes to this website, what podcasts do they listen to? Of everyone that listens to this podcast, what other podcasts do they listen to? Everybody that goes to this event, what podcasts do they listen to? It's a way to build lookalike audiences. And I'll give you an example here. We had a client that came to us, very smart young man. He'd built a couple businesses, had a new book out, and he said, I want to be on HBR IdeaCast. Great podcast, right? Harvard Business Review puts it on. Well, this person was a high school dropout and had built two great companies in his early 20s. And I'm like, there's no way that this place that is selling people on why they need to get PhDs and MBAs is going to have you on. But ultimately, what you want to do is talk to the audience that listens to IdeaCast. And so we're able to say, okay, everybody that subscribes to IdeaCast, what other podcasts can they find? And that's great. Or, if we say somebody tells us all of my clients go to this conference, well, we can say of all the people that go to that conference, go to that website, what podcasts are they listening to? Or if your if your website gets enough traffic, we can even benchmark that off the traffic of your website, right? Current clients are going to your website. What podcasts are they looking at?
Yeah, and sourcing from there. I love it. So that's great if they know kind of, who they want to speak to. These are some strategies to figure out if they're speaking to the right audience. But are there any strategies or methods that they can use to identify their ideal client profile if they might not know and ensure that they are speaking to the right crowd?
Yes. And one of the things you'll hear me say a lot is that we all have opinions. The only people that are the experts are your clients, right? The ones that are voting with their time and their money. So one of the things that you can use podcasts for is market research. So go on various podcasts and make sure you attribute the traffic as it comes back, and you'll be able to see which audiences are resonating best with your message. And I'll give you an example here. We worked with a client, great tax professional, and he said that he wanted to work with 50 different clients in 50 different industries in 50 different states. And I'm like, why? And he's like, because last year or last downturn, I was brick and mortar on Long Island, right? So he wanted to diversify. Okay. So we start going out on all these different podcasts, right? Then, Jessica, he got on a dental podcast. And because we were attributing the traffic, we could see, wow, this was like fish in a barrel. And we took it to him and he said, yeah, I've already gotten one client from that. And I think I've got a couple more conversations already scheduled. And this was like a couple of weeks after the podcast went live. So with that, we knew based on the feedback that his audience was dentists, right? That's what was working best. So for the next 5 or 6 months, all we did was double down on that. And so a lot of times when we have newer clients or newer companies, they say, well, we think this is our audience. And so it's like, okay, well, let's test that. Let's fish in different ponds and see which ones are converting the best.
Yeah, that's perfect. It makes great sense. So you mentioned the importance of speaking to a viable number of people. I know a common question that can come up is, how can someone determine or estimate the listens or downloads of a podcast to ensure that it's worth their time?
This is like the question of all times, and it's gotten even more important here as we're talking mid 2024. So what's a listen? What's a download? What's a stream? All of these are getting redefined. And sometimes we're looking at numbers that are meaningless, right? You'll hear people say, well, it's a top 1% podcast. Well, top 1% podcast of all podcasts sounds really good, except when you realize that 87% of podcasts are dead, right? So everybody's top 13%. So you've got to watch what that is. Even in iTunes now, and Apple, they just rechanged a lot of things, right? It used to be that when you subscribe to a podcast, they would download every episode. And now Apple has changed that. So if you don't listen to it, they're not going to push more there. So the download numbers are more like listens, right? So they're tracking more. So download numbers are down, listen numbers are up. But now podcasts, 90% of them have video. So there's podcasts that nobody's ever downloaded. They haven't streamed, but they're watching it on YouTube. And that's not included in the numbers. What we're really talking about now is, don't worry about one individual metric, right? It's trying to optimize on one piece of data, and that could be listens, downloads, subscribers. Let's look at the impact. What is the impact of this podcast? And as we look at this, there's really 6 major factors that impact your results from a podcast. Yes, how many people are going to engage with it, right? Or listen to it, right? But then there's also engagement. There's a difference between whether or not they're just passively listening or they're engaging with the show, right? I'd rather talk with a smaller group of engaged people than a bunch of people that are just very, very passive. So look at listens, look at engagement. Hosts are promoting it on social media. So look at how much social media, how active they are on there. We had mentioned YouTube before, right? YouTube has now become the largest search engine for podcasts. And you'll have people that say, I don't listen to podcasts, but they'll follow Joe Rogan on YouTube. All right. I don't care where you listen to me, just as long as you listen, right? Another one is search engine optimization, right? Some people do podcasts just for the backlinks, just for the SEO, because that will help them get found organically. And especially today with AI, and everybody's thinking, oh, this is ChatGPT created this. With this collaborative content, listeners, viewers, even the search engines realize that when you and I are talking here, this is authentic, and that's going to improve the impact of it. And then finally, the one I look at is how many episodes do they have out there, right? If it's a brand new podcast, we all start someplace. But if you've got a brand new podcast, the host isn't going to be as fluid with this. They're not as engaged. It's not working there as well. So look at the longevity of the podcast. The dirty little fact in podcasting is that 80% of podcasts die within the first 10 episodes. It's called pod fade, right? So you don't want to be on a show where you're number 7 and they stop paying the hosting bill at number 8. So forget downloads, forget listens, forget single points. Look at impact. And to me, impact is how many people are going to hear you? How much are they engaging? How much are they promoting on social media? Are they promoting on YouTube? What's that backlink worth to me? And how experienced is the host?
Well, it sounds to me like, as someone who wants to go on podcasts, it's more what is my most important, what do I find the most value in? If I find the most value in backlinks and they have 20,000 listeners but no website, I'm not going to get those backlinks. Or, vice versa. If listeners are, the most important to me and such, and I don't care if they're on social media and such, we just need to kind of identify to see the most impact that we want for our message.
And that's something that we talk about, like what's most important to you, right? Are you trying to grow your Instagram? Well, then go after podcasts with a larger Instagram following. Are you trying to build your YouTube? Well, just look at the YouTube numbers, right there. I can think of one client that we had. He went on to become Mark Cuban's head of growth, strategic growth. And he came to us and he was the first one that really pointed out to me the power of the backlink. And he didn't care what the other metrics were, but if there was a podcast, here I am in Kalamazoo, Michigan, right? If there was a podcast from Kalamazoo Valley Community College that ended in a .edu, he would say, I want to be on that podcast, because that backlink to him was more valuable than being on the Joe Rogan podcast. So really look at what's most important to you. Not everybody's going to be a 10 across every category there, but just try to figure out what's most important to you.
Absolutely. So obviously controlling the crowd is the foundation for that maximum impact that we can have when going on podcasts. How does it directly affect the ability to control the conversions and the conversations that we're going to talk about over the next 2 weeks?
Yeah. If you're not talking to the right people, it doesn't matter what you offer them. It's not going to convert, right? And sometimes people will say, well, podcast guesting didn't work for me. And it's like, well, why did you think that your customers were there, right? If they're not even interested in it, it may be entertaining for them. It may be educational, but if they don't have the need, right? If they don't have the budget, no matter what you say, it's not going to convert. So once again, you can't say enough of the right things to the wrong people. The other thing is that as you promote that, like controlling the conversations, if you're not talking to the right people, it could hurt you, right? So sometimes I'll call them Wayne's World podcasts. Wayne's World, 2 guys in their mom's basement. If you've got this high level B2B professional services offering, who you associate yourself with is important. So if you have this interview on this cheesy little podcast with poor audio quality, with poor video quality, where it's a new host, if you repurpose that and promote it, it's going to hurt you. It won't help you. So you want to be proud of every interview there. And so it's that thinking long-term with it. And, Steve Acho was a client, and he's the one that said, more is not better, better is better. Right. And so that's one of those things that we always go into. Just don't try getting more podcasts. bigger podcasts because those are important. No, it's like if you're not talking to the right people, multiplying it isn't going to help you. If changing your offers on the controlling the conversions, if you don't have people that could buy, changing your offers is meaningless. And then, like we said, on repurposing that content, you want to have content that you're proud of, that's going to help you, not hurt you. So like you said, if you listen to nothing else, just listen to controlling the crowd, right? If you've got that, then you can go on to other things. Without that, you're just wasting your time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure talking about controlling the crowd. Do you have any last comments or thoughts before we close up?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I would just say what you have is ordinary to you, but it's amazing to other people, right? The things that we have learned in our business, in our profession, could help people, but not everyone, right? And I think of the person that's trying to figure out second grade math, the person that has figured out fourth grade math is a genius to them and can help them, right? If that person that's trying to help fourth grade math, if they try going and helping college math, they're going to be laughed at. So try to figure out who your people are, who you can help. Because at the end of the day, we're not trying to maximize for leads. We're not trying to maximize for clicks. If we're in business here, we're trying to maximize for value, the value that we put out into the market. And in capitalism, that's shown as profits, right? You want to talk to people that value what you do, that are more than happy to give you that certificates of appreciation, right? The dollar bills to show you how much they value that. And it's not just a more thing or bigger thing. It's finding those right people, control the crowds, and podcast guesting gets a lot more effective with that.
The rest shall follow. Thanks, Tom. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Jessica.
So there you have it. That is how to control the crowd. How to make sure that you're talking to the right people, not just random people. Now, next week, we're going to be digging into the next section, controlling the conversions. Now, if you control the crowd and control the conversions, you will do everything possible to increase your impact to every listener.